Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. Our today's session is on the fourth book of Joseph Andrews, the novel that we are studying as the first novel of our course. Again, in this session we would look at the text and we would do critical analysis of the selected parts of the text as well as the general points related to the book fourth that we are doing in this session. Before I move forward, I would like to share a review of the previous session with you. As far as previous session was concerned, in that we started book 3 of the novel. Since book 3 has 13 chapters only, in that session we covered all the chapters and finished that book. Headings of the chapters and important happenings in these chapters were discussed. Important points of discussion with reference to critical analysis were brought forth and critically analyzed. Important parts of text with reference to themes, development of characters, plot and structure were discussed. I also pointed out Fielding as a moralist and referred to those parts of the text where he is doing his moral preaching. His art of characterization, how he helps his characters develop through the novel, was also analyzed and explored. As far as today's session is concerned, we will start book 4, that is the last book of the novel Joseph Andrews. Since book 4 is quite long and it has 16 chapters, it is not possible to cover all the chapters in one session. So in the current session, we will cover only first 10 chapters and we would move from chapter 1 to 10, looking at the headings of the chapters as well as important happenings in these chapters. Important critical and analytical points would be also presented to you and would be discussed. Important parts of the text would be shown and would be read to you with reference to themes, development of characters, and with reference to the development of plot and structure. These parts of text would be explored. Again, I would look at Fielding as a moralist and as a satirist and would point out how he does this job through the text. His art of characterization would also be looked at. Starting with chapter 1 of book 4, when we look at its heading, it goes like following. The arrival of Lady Booby and the rest at Booby Hall. Well, I hope you remember that in book 13 we noticed that all the major characters of the novel, they were traveling back to the countryside, to the Lady Booby's area where she used to live before she went to London. Now all these characters, they start reaching here. We already know that Joseph Andrews, Fanny and Parson Adams, they have come back. Now Lady Booby also comes at the parish and she stays there. Let's see what happens in chapter 1 of book 4. As I've already said, that Lady Booby returns to Booby Hall. The poor people of the parish are happy since they depend on her charity. Again, when Fielding mentions that people are happy to see her because she is the source of providing them some charity that helps them fulfill their everyday requirements, Fielding as a satirist is pointing out human nature where our happiness in relation to others is much dependent on our personal needs and on our selfishness. However, the case of Parson Adams, Joseph and Fanny is very different. Since all the three of them also return, people are also happy to see them. There is a difference in their reception of Adams and Lady Booby. While they are happy to see Lady Booby, as many of their needs are fulfilled by the charity she gives, they give a more heartfelt welcome to Parson Adams, who is really closer to their hearts. Adams takes both of them to his home, that is Fanny and Joseph to his home, where Mrs. Adams provides for them. Fielding has given a detailed description of the emotional turbulence Lady Booby has been through since the departure of Joseph from London. She decides to return to the countryside for the same reason, because she believed that this change of scene would help her to conquer her passion for Joseph. And it happens so that then comes the first Sunday of her stay in the country. As she has to go to the church for services, she goes there but spends more time leering at Joseph than attending to Parson Adams. Again, not only the nature of Lady Booby, but also her too much interest in Joseph is shown through her visit to the church, where Fielding points out that she goes there, but to her, Joseph is more center of attraction than what Parson Adams is preaching there. During the service, Adams announces the wedding banns of Joseph and Fanny. Later in the day, Lady Booby summons Adams to her place for some discussion. And as readers, we can very well imagine why she summons for Adams. Of course, she is not happy to hear the news of the upcoming marriage of Joseph and Fanny, and she doesn't want Parson Adams to play any role, especially a positive role in that. That is why maybe she has called him. With this, we move to the second chapter of Book 4, and the heading runs as follows: A dialogue between Mr. Abraham Adams and the Lady Booby. So we as readers, by looking at this heading, are prepared that there would be conversations, not only conversations, but maybe a conflict between Parson Adams and Lady Booby regarding the marriage of Joseph and Fanny. For your interest, here is some text from Book 4, Chapter 2. This is a dialogue between Adams and Lady Booby. The text runs as follows. This is Parson Adams, who says, "I only perform my office to Mr. Joseph. Pray, don't mistrust such fellows to me," cries the lady. "He," said the parson, "with the consent of Fanny, before my face put in the banns." "Yes," answered the lady, "I suppose the slut is forward enough. Slipslop tells me how her head runs upon fellows. That is one of her beauties, I suppose. But if they have put in the banns, I desire you will publish them no more without my orders." So this is what is the command of Lady Booby. "Madam," cries Adams, "if anyone puts in a sufficient caution and assigns a proper reason against them, I am willing to surcease." "I tell you a reason," says she. "He is a vagabond, and he shall not settle here and bring a nest of beggars into the parish. It will make us but little amends that they will be beauties." "Madam," answered Adams, "with the utmost submission to your ladyship, I have been informed by Lawyer Scout that any person who serves a year gains a settlement in the parish where he serves." So what as readers we can notice through the reading of this part of the text is that Parson Adams is not ready to surrender to the will of Lady Booby. Lady Booby wants the banns not to be published. She wants to put a stop to the upcoming marriage of Joseph Andrews and Fanny. However, since she does not have any solid reason for that, only her jealousy from Fanny and her hatred for Fanny, and we may say her love for Joseph, is the reason for that, which of course she cannot share with Parson Adams. So she is just creating excuses for that. When Parson Adams asks why after all he should stop the proceedings of the wedding, she says because Joseph Andrews is a vagabond and because they are not good people. And defending Joseph and Fanny, Parson Adams says that there is no sufficient evidence of any such thing. Plus, the lawyer Scout has already said that any person who serves a year gains a settlement in the parish. So, as such, nobody can stop Fanny and Joseph to get married and be settled in the parish. The text of Book 4, Chapter 2, that is a dialogue between Adams and Lady Booby, continues, and here is some more extract for your interest. "Lawyer Scout," replied the lady, is an impudent coxcomb. I will have no lawyer scout interfere with me. I repeat to you again, I will have no more encumbrances brought on us. So I desire you will proceed no farther. Madam, returned Adams, I would obey your ladyship in everything that is lawful, but surely the parties being poor is no reason against their marrying. God forbid there should be any such law. The poor have little share enough of this world already. It would be barbarous indeed to deny them the common privileges and innocent enjoyments which nature indulges to the animal creation. Since you understand yourself no better, cries the lady, nor the respect due from such as you to a woman of my distinction, than to affront my ears by such loose discourse, I shall mention but one short word. It is my orders to you that you publish these pens no more, and if you dare, I will recommend it to your master, the doctor, to discard you from his service. So what we notice is that as Parson Adams does not surrender to the will of Lady Booby, and as he is not ready to put a stop to the proceedings of their marriage on the grounds that they are, and he says that poor people should not be underprivileged in this way, that they are stopped from enjoying the basic privileges of life that are even offered to animals by nature. Lady Booby is very much angry to listen to all this, and what she says finally is that in short words, in one short word she uses, it is my order to you that you do not publish the banns of their marriage. And she says that if he would still do that, she threatens that she would ask his master, the doctor, to discard him from his service. Overall, the happenings of this chapter indicate that Lady Booby criticizes Parson Adams for being associating with a footman whom Lady Booby dismissed from her service. She also uses very bad language for Fanny. She further criticizes Adams for endeavoring to procure a match between these two people which will be to the ruin of them both. Parson Adams tries to defend the couple, but Lady Booby takes offense at his emphasis on Fanny's beauty. She is so much infuriated by this that she orders Adams to put a stop to publishing their banns. And you must understand that this is a part of the marriage in Christianity, that a couple's weddings banns must be published 3 times before a marriage can take place. Parson Adams demands a reason and a justification for this action, and in response to this, Lady Booby declares that Joseph is a vagabond whom she will not allow to settle in her parish and bring a nest of beggars into it. It is very interesting when we critically look at these comments of Lady Booby, because we know about the character of Lady Booby. We know her hypocrisy, we also know her affectation, we also know her indulgence in all those activities that would be beyond virtue. And when she makes all these claims, we can easily notice how Fielding is presenting the theme of affectation and hypocrisy through her character. She behaves as if she is a very pious woman and all the other people around are of inferior nature as well as of inferior virtue. Adams tells her that despite her opposition, he will marry the young couple. Lady Booby threatens him that he would be dismissed from his curacy, and Adams also asserts that to be poor is no reason against marrying. What we notice about the development of the character of Parson Adams is that sometimes, though we found him to be a very funny character, we also found him to be absent-minded and lost in his own thoughts. We also found him forgetful about a lot of things. But here he emerges as a very, very strong man who not only counter-argues whatsoever Lady Booby says, but also is firm enough to stick to what he thinks is right. Anyhow, Lady Booby declares that she will never allow him in her house again, and this is the point where the chapter comes to an end. With this, we move on to the next chapter, that is chapter 3 of book 4, and it has a heading that says, What passed between the lady and lawyer scout? So again, we are ready to see a dialogue between the lady and lawyer Scout, and let's see what happens. Here are the important points of the happenings in this chapter. We already know that Lady Booby is very much infuriated on Adam's reaction to her orders, as he does not agree to what she says. In her anger, she summons lawyer Scout and demands that he supply the legal justification for her resolution that none of her discarded servants has the right to settle in the parish. Here what we can notice is the cunningness, the clever and selfish approach of Lady Booby, that on the financial and economic basis, since others are her servants, she can exploit them to the extent she wants to, for the mere reason that they are servants. In order to oblige her, Scout makes a hair-splitting distinction between settlement in law and settlement in fact, saying that if they can demonstrate that Joseph is not settled in fact, then Mr. Adams will have no justification to publish Joseph's wedding banns. If, however, Joseph manages to get married, the situation would change. This is what the lawyer says. When a man is married, he is settled in fact, and then he is not removable. Scout, however, promises to persuade Mr. Adams not to publish the bans of marriage. He promises to create a situation that would be favorable for Lady Booby to be able to remove both Joseph and Fanny from the parish with the help of Justice Frolic. Again, it is Fielding's knowledge of law and the legal systems in the country that come into the discussion. Fielding not only provides insights into the loopholes of the legal system, but also reveals that Scout acts as a lawyer without having the proper qualifications required. Well, dear students, as far as the critical examination of chapters 1 to 3 is concerned, there are some important points that I would still like to share, and that I think are important to be reiterated. Fielding's personal experience as a magistrate is reflected in this whole episode where Lady Booby calls lawyer Scout to seek some legal help. Whereas the corruption of legal system matches the individual corruption and hypocrisy of Lady Booby, we also notice how the steadfast honesty of Adams stands in direct contrast to the sly hypocrisy of the Scout, who promises to ensure for certain favors that no law stands in the way of the will of Lady Booby be done. So it is the hypocrisy of Lady Booby and her selfishness versus the selfishness of lawyer Scout, and it is also Lady Booby's hypocrisy and her moral corruption versus the corruption of the legal system of the country. And by these comparisons and contrasts, actually Fielding presents to us the whole picture of what was going on the individual level as well as on the societal level. These chapters are the opening chapters of book 4, and they lay a kind of groundwork or the background for the novel's final conflict and the eventual resolution. The principal good characters have returned to the place of their origin, and their primary adversary, Lady Booby, arrives back on the scene as well, along with Slipslop, who her subaltern and imitator is. Book 4 will turn out to be a more unified book than the preceding 3 in terms of both the place and the time of the action, as Fielding confines the events to the Booby's parish and specifies the passage of a discrete number of days. The overall effect gives a sense of coherent dramatic conflict, rather different from the diffused picaresque plotting of books 1 through 3. Well, this is what I am saying with reference to the development of the plot and the structure of the novel. Maybe as readers you would have noticed that as the novel started, and in the first book, not only Joseph Andrews and Lady Booby moved towards London, that is the city life, but also gradually we found other important characters moving towards London. For example, Adams on his way to sell his manuscripts, Fanny on her way to meet Joseph Andrews as she comes to know about all the difficulties he was caught up in. in all that process, what we saw that most of the time the characters were shown on the road, staying in the inns, meeting strangers, having dialogues with other travelers, being caught up in situations on their journey, being rescued by other characters who emerged on the scene. And through all that, Fielding developed his major themes. However, because these were all the episodes or instances of traveling, so in terms of plot and structure, they might seem slightly loose to the reader. Now, in the fourth book, all the characters have come back to Lady Booby's seat, to the parish, where now all of them would stay, and within the framework of a few days, using the unities of time and place, Fielding would resolve all the conflicts to lead the whole story towards a proper and appropriate ending. So in that sense, the fourth chapter is far more concrete and far more well structured. From the perspective of the plot and structure of the novel, this chapter is far, far stronger as compared to the first three chapters as well. Anyhow, this leads us to the fourth chapter of book 4, which has a heading, a short chapter but very full of matter, particularly the arrival of Mr. Booby and his lady. Again, what we notice is that within the main plot, slight diversion is included, and the diversion is not like the previous diversions where the story completely took a subplot and took a different turn. Here, Mr. Booby and Lady Booby are going to play their role in the main plot. However, a slight diversion in terms of their introduction and their background story is brought in this chapter. Here is the opening text of chapter 4 that I would like to share with you. The chapter starts, all that night and the next day, the Lady Booby passed with the utmost anxiety. Her mind was distracted and her soul tossed up and down by many turbulent and opposite passions. She loved, hated, pitied, scorned, admired, despised the same person by fits, which changed in a very short interval. On Tuesday morning, which happened to be a holiday, she went to the church, where to her surprise Mr. Adams published the banns again with as audible a voice as before. It was lucky for her that as there was no sermon, she had an immediate opportunity of returning home to vent her rage, which she could not have concealed from the congregation for 5 minutes. The text continues that she could not conceal her rage from the congregation for 5 minutes indeed. It was not then very numerous, the assembly consisting of no more than Adams, his clerk, his wife, the lady, and one of her servants. At her return, she met Slipslop, who accosted her in these words, "Oh, ma'am, what doth your ladyship think? To be sure, Lawyer Scout hath carried Joseph and Fanny both before the justice. All the parish are in tears, and they say they will certainly be hanged, for nobody knows what it is for. I suppose they deserve it," says the lady. "What, dost thou mention such wretches to me?" "Oh, dear madam," answered Slipslop, "is it not a pity such a graceless young man should die a virulent death? I hope the judge will take commensuration on his youth. As for Fanny, I don't think it signifies much what becomes of her. And if poor Joseph hath done anything, I could venture to swear she traduces him to it. Few men ever come to a fragrant punishment but by those nasty creatures who are a scandal to our sect." Well, with reference to this part of the text, there are a few important things that are to be noticed. Number one, the language of Slipslop. She uses heavy, thick, difficult words, and she always uses them wrong. Here again, incorrect language use can be immediately noticed. For example, if you look at the very bottom of the slide, the use of "to a flagrant punishment." What she maybe wants to say is "to a flagrant punishment. But the confidence with which he uses language in an incorrect way is a characteristic of slip-slop. Another important thing with reference to this part of the text is slip-slop's attitude towards Joseph and Fanny. On one hand, she wants to save Joseph. Even if Joseph has something bad, if he has done something wrong, what she believes in is that men generally suffer this kind of punishment because of women, that what she says, the nasty creatures who are a scandal to our sect, that is the gender of women. And what she says is that it is women who bring this kind of punishment to men. So what she tries to do is to prove Joseph innocent. The second thing that is important is her attitude towards Fanny. And what she says is, as for Fanny, I don't think it signifies much what becomes of her. So she is completely disinterested in the fate of Fanny. This cruel-heartedness is a very significant feature because combined with hypocrisy and vanity, this becomes one of the significant ills of the society of the times. What we find in this chapter is that Lady Booby is very much stressed emotionally. The stress continues to be piled up, and as she goes to the church on Tuesday, there is again a bad news for her. She's so much disturbed to hear Parson Adams publishing the second of Joseph and Fanny's wedding banns. As she returns home, she learns from Mrs. Slipslop that Joseph and Fanny have been brought before the justice. Well, Lady Booby is not at all pleased with this news because though she wanted Fanny to be sent far enough, she did not want Joseph to be sent away, especially with Fanny. While Lady Booby is considering how to act, a coach arrives bringing her nephew, Mr. Booby. This Mr. Booby is the husband of Pamela and she is accompanying him. Lady Booby is hearing of Mr. Booby's marriage for the first time. So, at the very outset of the novel, when Fielding introduced us through Joseph Andrews and we were told that he is the brother of Pamela Andrews, this Pamela Andrews now is the wife of Mr. Booby, and both Mr. Booby and Mrs. Booby, that is Mrs. Pamela Booby, they come to see Lady Booby. And interesting part of all this is that Lady Booby doesn't know about this marriage before it. It is only that this is revealed to her. This leads us to chapter 5 of book 4, and the heading runs as follows. Containing justice business, curious precedents of dispositions and other matters necessary to be pursued by all justices of the peace and their clerks. We as readers are prepared to see some happenings that are important with reference to the legal system. So let's see what happens in this chapter. Mr. Booby's servants soon begin to ask after Joseph, who has not been in contact with Pamela since he was dismissed by Lady Booby. Now, it is very natural. Pamela, because of her love for her brother, wants to find out where Joseph is. So Mr. Booby sends his servants to find him out. The servants soon explore the whole story and inform Mr. Booby. As Mr. Booby comes to know about Joseph's situation, he resolves to take care of it. He decides to intervene so that he could liberate Joseph from the clutches of Lady Booby before Pamela finds out what has happened. So he arrives on the scene just as Justice Frolic is about to send Joseph and Fanny to Bridewell prison. In a way, here Mr. Booby comes as the rescuer to rescue Joseph and Fanny right on time when they are about to be sent to the prison. Now, it turns out so that the justice happens to be an acquaintance of Mr. Booby. Mr. Booby asks him about their crime. He himself reads the disposition and finds that Joseph and Fanny stand accused of having stolen a twig from lawyer Scout's property. Now, of course, Mr. Booby objects to this, whereupon Justice Frolic takes him aside and explains that the constable will probably let the prisoners escape, but that the accusation of theft is the only way to help Lady Booby fulfill her desire of keeping them away from her parish. Again, what we can notice is the corruption of the whole legal system, where each and every member of this legal system is involved in this corruption, plays his or her role in this corruption, and supports others to exploit it for corruption. Mr. Booby promises that Joseph and Fanny will never encumber the parish, and the justice is ready to give the couple into Mr. Booby's custody. He also burns the mittimus. Again, you can see the play of the power of money. Mr. Booby has power that can equate and maybe in some cases can challenge the power of Lady Booby, not in terms of money but also in terms of societal setup. So the constable, the lawyer, the justice, everybody has to surrender to what Mr. Booby says, and they have to promise to Mr. Booby that Joseph and Fanny will never be encumbered from the parish, and the final result is that the justice burns the mittimus, and then there is no proof of any kind against Joseph and Fanny. While Joseph gets dressed in a suit of Mr. Booby's clothes, the justice invites Fanny to settle with Joseph in the justice's own parish. And we can clearly notice that the justice is doing this to please Mr. Booby. This is not a favor that is done to Joseph or Fanny out of any goodness of heart or as a practice of virtue. Rather, this is done to please Mr. Booby, and it is for very, very selfish ends. At some other time point, maybe he would be gaining something back from Mr. Booby as a favor. There are some other important happenings in this chapter as well. When Mr. Booby takes Joseph and Fanny in his own coach, they drive back to Lady Booby's place. On the way, they find Mr. Adams, who is walking in a field, so they also picked him up. At this time point, Mr. Booby reveals that he has married Pamela. Of course, everyone, that is Adams, Joseph and Fanny, they are happy on this news. As they reach Booby Hall, Mr. Booby reintroduces Joseph to Lady Booby. Now, of course, he is introduced as the brother of Pamela. He expresses his desire that Joseph will be treated with due respect that he deserves as a family member. Now, the status, the position, and resultantly the expected response to Joseph Andrews, everything has changed. Lady Booby agrees to this, but in case of Fanny, she is not ready to accept her. Again, the snobbishness of Lady Booby, her hypocrisy, and her vanity comes in the way. And Lady Booby, though because of Mr. Booby, and because of the fact that Joseph is now a family member of Mr. Booby's family, she has to accept Joseph. Also because in her heart she has a passion for Joseph, so she is ready to accept this. But when it comes to Fanny, she is not ready to accept her as a member of the family. Joseph prepares to meet Pamela, while Fanny goes with Mr. Adams to his place, where she would stay for quite a while. Now that all the situation has changed, Joseph's status and position has changed as being declared a member of the family, let's see what happens in the next chapter. That is chapter 6, and the heading of this chapter says, "Of which you are desired to read no more than you like." Well, very ambiguous kind of heading, so we don't know what is going to happen in this. Let's quickly see what happens. The brother and the sister, that is Joseph and Pamela, meet after quite a long time. This is a tearful reunion, of course. Joseph shares with Pamela all the adventures he had after leaving London. In the evening, he reluctantly agrees to stay the night in Booby Hall rather than joining Fanny and Mr. Adams. Naturally, he wants to go back. He doesn't want to stay at this place, firstly because of Lady Booby, and secondly because he wants to meet Fanny and he thinks that he would be more comfortable at Adams' place. As night falls, Lady Booby retires to her room and with the help of Mrs. Slipslop defames both Pamela and Fanny. Again, this is her vanity that makes her speak against Pamela and Fanny both. They then discuss Joseph as well. During the conversation, Slipslop defends Joseph passionately against Lady Booby's charge of being coarse. She goes to the extent of saying that she wishes she herself were a great lady so that she could make a gentleman of him and marry him. Well, what we need to notice here is that since the very beginning of the novel, where Slipslop would keep on offering delicacies and sweets to Joseph, we found even in the initial chapters that when in London, Lady Booby was very much angry with Joseph Andrews, who could not understand her advances and moves. Even in that situation, Slipslop wanted to rescue, wanted to save Joseph Andrews. Well, Slipslop wanted to do this not because of her good nature as such, rather because of her own selfish purposes. She too had a secret passion for this young man in her heart. That is why she wanted to do this. Anyhow, throughout the novel, we find evidences where whensoever there comes up a situation, Slipslop always defends Joseph and tries to save him. Lady Booby calls Mrs. Slipslop a comical creature in response to all this. Next morning, Joseph visits Fanny at Adams' place. They also finalize Monday as their wedding date. Dear students, with this we move on to chapter 7. And the heading of chapter 7 of book 4 is Philosophical Reflections, the like not to be found in any light French romance. Mr. Booby's grave advice to Joseph and Fanny's encounter with a beau. So a lot of happenings we are expecting to find in this chapter. Let's see what happens in this chapter. Mainly in this chapter, Fielding talks about the psychology of women. He explains why it is that women often discover in love a small inclination to deceit. And the justification that he gives is that from childhood women are taught to fear and avoid the opposite sex. So that when as adults they begin to find him agreeable, they compensate by counterfeiting the antipathy, as Lady Booby has done with respect to Joseph. Here what we notice about Fielding is that he has insights into human psychology. Fielding tells the readers that Lady Booby loves him much more than she thought, especially now that she finds him dressed like a gentleman. So Lady Booby now has another reason to like him, and his gentleman's appearance is yet another attraction for Lady Booby. She in fact has formed a plan to separate him from Fanny. Again, the cunning and cruel nature of Lady Booby, as well as her vanity that takes Joseph as what she deserves to have as a match, makes her plan against Fanny and Joseph, and she plans to separate Fanny from Joseph. For this, she convinces Mr. Booby to dissuade Joseph from marrying Fanny on the grounds that the alliance would make it impossible for the Boobies to make the Andrews family a part of the upper class gentry. Again, class distinction, that is one of the major themes, comes up, and what we can notice is that it is vanity and it is materialism that makes Lady Booby say all this, and that also makes Mr. Booby consider all this. They think that by including Joseph Andrews in the family, they are okay, but by including Fanny, who belongs to a poor origin, a poor social class, they would be blemishing the reputation of the family. Mr. Booby, despite all his goodness, is also under the influence of this societal setup. That is why he agrees to this plan and talks to Joseph. However, Joseph disagrees to his brother-in-law's suggestions even when Pamela joins the argument. Important thing that we need to notice is that Pamela also takes Mr. Booby's side, and she also does not take Joseph's side. Joseph, though, is all alone in what he thinks right, but he is not ready to surrender. Continuing on what happens in chapter 7 of this book, I would say that Fanny walks in an avenue near Booby Hall and meets a gentleman with his servants. Now this gentleman attempts to force himself on Fanny, and when he fails in doing so, he continues on to Booby Hall while leaving a servant behind to persuade Fanny to go home with the gentleman. Now this man, the servant who is left there, he also tries to take advantage of Fanny, and it is just by a stroke of luck that Joseph comes there and he rescues Fanny by beating off this man who is the servant of the gentleman. With this important part of the happenings, Fielding moves on to the next chapter, that is chapter 8 of book 4. And the heading of this chapter runs like this: a discourse which happened between Mr. Adams, Mrs. Adams, Joseph and Fanny, with some behavior of Mr. Adams which will be called by some few readers very low, absurd and unnatural. Well, here is some important text. In fact, this is the opening text of chapter 8 that I am going to share with you, and I hope this would provide insights to the readers into the very psychology and very important aspects of the personalities of the characters who are involved. The text goes as follows: the parson and his wife had just ended a long dispute when the lovers came to the door. Indeed, this young couple had been the subject of the dispute, for Mrs. Adams was one of those prudent people who never do anything to injure their families, or perhaps one of those good mothers who would even stretch their conscience to serve their children. She had long entertained hopes of seeing her eldest daughter succeed Mrs. Slipslop, and of making her second son an exciseman by Lady Booby's interest. These were expectations she could not endure the thoughts of quitting, and was therefore very uneasy to see her husband so resolute to oppose the lady's intention in Fanny's affair. She told him it behoved every man to take the first care of his family, that he had a wife and 6 children, the maintaining and providing for whom would be business enough for him without intermeddling in other folks' affairs, that he had always preached up submission to superiors, and would do ill to give an example of the contrary behavior in his own conduct, that if Lady Booby did wrong, she must answer for it herself. Well, as a matter of fact, we would continue with some more text on the next slide, but before we move on to the next slide, I would like to share a few important critical insights into this part of the text. We are told that when Joseph and Fanny reach Adams' place, actually Mr. and Mrs. Adams, they have just ended up a long dispute, and the cause of this dispute are these two young people, that is Joseph and Fanny. Basically, Mrs. Adams is criticizing Mr. Adams for not listening to the orders of Lady Booby. As a satirist, Fielding tells us that Mrs. Adams is one of those prudent people who never do anything to injure their families, or perhaps one of those good mothers who would even stretch their conscience to serve their children. कैसे हम अपने मकसद के लिए, for our own purpose, कैसे हम अपने ज़मीर की आवाज़ को दबा लेते हैं, कैसे हम चीज़ों के मायने थोड़े से बदल लेते हैं, कैसे हम चीज़ों को we interpret them according to our own desires. This is what Fielding is pointing out. She, that is Mrs. Adams, gave certain logics and arguments to Parson Adams to convince him not to support Fanny, rather to submit to the orders of Lady Booby. She says that the main duty of Parson Adams is his wife and 6 children, and to maintain and provide for them is his main business, so he should not intermeddle with other affairs, with the lives of others, and should focus on earning for his family. She also says that Parson Adams has always been preaching about submitting to the superior. So in this case, since Lady Booby is superior to him, he should submit to the will of Lady Booby. Here the same point, as I said earlier, that we as human beings, under the pressure of our own desires that we want to get fulfilled, how we interpret things in different ways. That when Parson Adams would preach to people about submission to the superior, actually by superior he would mean God. But here Mrs. Adams interprets it in a very different way that suits actually her. The final argument that Mrs. Adams gives to Parson Adams is that even if Lady Booby is doing something wrong, she is answerable for that herself. So basically what she's trying to do is that she's trying to convince Adams that he should not take it as a burden on his conscience, and he should do what Lady Booby wants, because that is the only way she can get the advantages of getting her own daughter employed at the place of Mrs. Slipslop after her, and her second son as an exciseman at Lady Booby's decision or her orders. Here is some more text that is taken from this chapter. This chapter is very important in terms of exploring human nature and providing insights into human psychology. This part of the text is about Parson Adams' reaction to the news of his son's death. In fact, when as they were quarreling, and then Joseph Andrews and Fanny entered there, and Joseph wanted to get married to Fanny, whereas Parson Adams asked him to submit to the will of God and to hold on for a while and not to be in hurry on that. While he was preaching that submission to the will of God is more important, it was the moment when he received the news by somebody that his son had drowned in water and had died. So this text tells us his reaction to all that. What he said was, this is Parson Adams' reaction, that is written by Fielding. At which words one came hastily in and acquainted Mr. Adams that his youngest son was drowned. He stood silent a moment and soon began to stamp about the room and deplore his loss with the bitterest agony. Joseph, who was overwhelmed with concern likewise, recovered himself sufficiently to endeavour to comfort the parson, in which attempt he used many arguments that he had at several times remembered out of his own discourses, both in private and public, for he was a great enemy to the passions and preached nothing more than the conquest of them by reason and grace. But he was not at leisure now to hearken to this advice. Child, child, said he, do not go about impossibilities. Had it been any other of my children, I could have borne it with patience. But my little prattler, the darling and comfort of my old age, the little wretch, to be snatched out of life just at his entrance into it, the sweetest, best-tempered boy who never did a thing to offend me. So, again, Fielding is showing the difference in appearances versus reality. Apparently, Parson Adams all the times keep on claiming that one should control his passion, one should be reasonable and graceful in accepting the will of God. But now when it comes to be his turn to accept the death of his son with grace and with reasonability, he is unable to do that. And again he creates logic for himself that had it been some other child, he would have been more patient. It is the youngest child that has been deprived of life just at the time when he has entered into the very life. So it is very difficult, he says, for him to bear this idea. So summing up what happens in chapter 8, I would say that Joseph and Fanny, who just come to Parson Adams' place, They come to know that Parson Adams and Mrs. Adams, they had finished an argument about whether Adams should have avoided offending Lady Booby for the sake of his family or not. As far as Adams is concerned, well, he's taking side of Fanny and Joseph, but when it comes to Mrs. Adams, she is of the opinion that the clergyman should oblige Lady Booby by ceasing to publish the bans. Again, her selfishness is very, very clear here, very evident here. However, Parson Adams does not agree to her, and he believes that he should do his duty without regarding the consequence it might have on his worldly interest. As Joseph and Fanny reach there and sit for breakfast, Joseph expresses his desire and eagerness to be married. However, Adams asks him to keep his intentions in marriage pure as per Christian religious values. As a true clergyman, he asserts, no Christian ought so to set his heart on any passion or thing in this world, but that whenever it shall be required or taken from him in any manner by divine providence, he may be able peaceably, quietly and contentedly to resign it. It is very interesting in the light of the previous part of the text that we read regarding the drowning and death of his son, that Parson Adams, who preaches that a man needs to learn that in what manner to be able to peaceably, quietly and contentedly to resign to the will of God, he himself is unable to do this. Ironically, Fielding, as a master of irony, brings the situation of the drowning of the young son of Parson Adams at the time point where all this is being said by Adams, and at this moment someone enters and talks to him and tells him that his youngest son has drowned. As Parson Adams weeps and cries on the news, Joseph Andrews tries to comfort him. In fact, he uses all the clergyman's own arguments about the conquering of the passions by reason and grace. But Adams is so much in grief that he does not listen to all this. However, the weeping Mr. Adams soon sees his young son running up to the house, not drowned after all. All of them come to know that the child was rescued from the river by the same peddler who helped the travelers in one of the inns where they could not pay their bill. Mr. Adams is, of course, extremely happy to see his son alive, and he greets the peddler with genuine gratitude. He is thankful to the peddler for saving the life of his son. Once things have calmed down, Adams takes Joseph aside to repeat his advice not to give too much way to thy passions, if thou dost expect happiness. However, now that Joseph has seen Adams' response to the news regarding the drowning of his son, he criticizes Adams and he asserts it was easier to give advice than to take it. And here again, Joseph, when he says it is easy to give advice than to take it, he becomes a mouthpiece of Fielding, who as a moralist and as a satirist suggests the true reality of life, that giving advice to others is very easy. That is why you would find people frequently doing that. But it is very difficult to take somebody's advice. Well, chapter 8 is quite lengthy in nature, so there are a lot of things happening in this chapter. As the boy is now saved, and Joseph criticizes Parson Adams for his preaching, this leads to an argument as to whether Joseph's love for Fanny is of the same pure and elevating nature as is Mr. Adams's fatherly love for his son or not. Mrs. Adams participates in this conversation at this time point, objecting that Mr. Adams does not enact his own disparagement of marital love. Not only has he been a loving husband, but, she says, I declare if I had not been convinced you had loved me as well as you could, I can answer for myself, I should have hated and despised you. The concluding remark of this conversation comes from Adam's wife. She asks Joseph, don't hearken to him. Mr. Joseph, be as good a husband as you are able and love your wife with all your body and soul too. With the advice of Parson Adams' wife to Joseph, chapter 8 comes to an end. However, there are some important points of discussion that I would like to share with reference to this chapter. In this chapter, we have seen that certain minor characters emerged and they played their role. The peddler, of course, remains an instrument of providence, and he will continue to perform this role in the coming chapters as well. If you remember, while they were traveling back home, it was this peddler who, at a point where they needed money to pay the bill for the inn, he appeared again as an instrument of providence. Kudrat ki taraf se bheja gaya, and he helped them. The family of Mr. Adams enters the story for the first time. This is what we noticed in this chapter, as do the newly married Mr. Booby and Pamela. So a lot of happenings take place in this part of the novel. The peddler turns up again, a lawyer and justice materialize. पिछले एक दो chapters में हमने notice किया कि it's not only that the central characters are involved in a lot of happenings, बल्कि बहुत से और characters, Mr. Booby, Lady Booby, Mr. Booby, Mrs. Booby, that is Pamela, the peddler, the lawyer, the Justice Frolic, the constable, all of them, they appear on the scene and they play their role in making the story move on. These secondary characters, whose ranks will swell in succeeding chapters, do more than fill out the stage. They all increase the tension between Lady Booby and the lovers, because Lady Booby schemes to get all of these originally neutral players on her side. All the members from the legal system, be it the constable, the lawyer or the justice, Lady Booby tries to win all of them and to use them for her benefits and selfish purposes of stopping the marriage of Joseph and Fanny. On the other hand, Mr. Booby also uses the same characters as instruments or tools to control the situation and to rescue Joseph and Fanny. So we see these characters playing important roles, though they are as such minor characters. Well, there are some recurring themes that we noticed through these chapters. The episode in which Mrs. Adams again counsels Joseph against passionate attachments, and then hearing of his own son's supposed drowning, fails to practice what he has preached, reveals another dimension of Adams's fallibility. Though whether his weakness makes him more or less sympathetic will be up to the eye of the beholder. What I want to say here is, we saw the development of different characters through the whole novel. We noticed that Parson Adams, his goodness, his simplicity, these were the important traits that were pointed out towards the beginning of the novel. However, as we moved forward, we noticed that Fielding started pointing out some other aspects of the personality of Parson Adams. Soon we were able to notice his forgetfulness, his over simplicity. Then we started noticing him in comparison with other characters where he was less prudent. Dear students, now at this time point of the novel, now in book 4, we noticed another important aspect of his personality. He who preached a lot of things with reference to patience, with reference to submission, he himself was unable to practice those virtues. And there are the happenings that are reflected through this incident again. This makes us recall the episode while on their journey back when Fanny was taken away and Adams and Joseph Andrews, they were tied to the bedposts. We can recall all those long preaching comments that Parson Adams gave to Joseph Andrews at that time as well. Now, in the light of all this, when we look at Adams' character, we are able to see his weaknesses and his follies both. This scene has, as I have earlier said, it has a precursor in book 3, chapter 11 that I have already referred to. When Adams, he was bound with Joseph to a bedpost, and he comforted this young boy or friend by arguing him to give up the folly of grief and resign himself contentedly to the cosmic plan that is about to subject the prettiest, kindest, loveliest, sweetest Fanny to the utmost violence which lust and power can inflict. The parson even construed the impending rape of Fanny as an act of divine justice, a punishment of Joseph for the sin of repining. The scene at the bedpost then revealed Adams as an inhuman sermonizer, failing to enact the spontaneous, sympathetic good nature that has generally distinguished him. He has a rationalistic side to his personality. It is the part of him that responds to the literature of classical Stoicism with its injunction to transcend all human feelings and attachments. And what we notice about Fielding is that as a satirist, he points out human follies through the character of Adams. Well, here are some more points that are important so far. Adams again advises Joseph to divest himself of all human passion. He is concerned that Joseph is too eager to get married, and he warns that if physical attraction is the motivation, that Joseph is sinning. In the same way, he tells Joseph that even if he is worried about the safety and welfare of Fanny, this motivation is to be reconsidered, because then Joseph ought to be putting his trust in Providence. Adams also instructs Joseph to prepare himself to accept even the loss of his beloved Fanny, peaceably, quietly, and contentedly. Fielding, of course, emerges here as a great satirist, as at this time point of the story, somebody comes on the scene to inform Adams about the drowning of his youngest son. So in terms of plot and structure, this is the perfect place to introduce the incident of drowning. Suddenly the tables are turned. The preacher, who so far had insisted that anyone who indulges in exorbitant grief is not worthy the name of a Christian, begins crying over his personal loss. And we as the readers can identify ourselves with Parson Adams, that most of the times we preach, but when it comes to practice, we find it difficult to practice the same virtue. Well, Adams as a father has to confront the idea that the divine will has demanded the death of his beloved son. Here the death of this child comes as a test of the father's faith and resignation. Despite the fact that Joseph asks the parson to follow his own advice, resign himself, and look forward to a reunion in heaven, Adams finds himself helpless in his expression of grief. Fielding brings in irony to show the reaction of the parson, though it proves to be doubly fortunate that Dick eventually turns out not to have drowned at all. As usual, however, Adams fails to see when his weakness has been exposed, and he quickly snaps back to his formal sermonizing mode. That is why he takes Joseph Andrews aside and again starts preaching about submission. As I said earlier, Mr. Adams' conspicuous failure by the lights of his own code has emboldened Joseph, and the young man points out his mentor's inconsistency and observes that it is easier to give advice than to take it. Fielding is again successful as a moralist. This scene seems to fit into Fielding's dominant theme of the exposure of pretense. Indeed, the passive resignation brand of Christianity that Adams has recommended in his stoical sermonizing is by no means identical with the active, charitable love of neighbor that he elsewhere advocates and consistently enacts. His extraordinary goodness takes its distinctive character not from his erudition or from his reason, but rather from his natural and spontaneous affection of the sort that he keeps censoring in Joseph. The proper attitude towards Mr. Adams is probably the one that Mrs. Adams espouses near the end of the scene, when, after expressing at length her affection for the husband, who is more generous than he will admit, she undercuts his teaching authority by saying, "Don't hearken to him, Mr. Joseph." Fielding likely means for the readers to follow Mrs. Adams in regarding the parson as thoroughly lovable but not always a reliable moral philosopher. And in doing so, what Fielding conveys to the reader is that being a clergyman or being a priest does not mean to be perfect human being, to be free from all the follies, foibles and weaknesses of a human being. At the end of the day, Parson Adams also is a human being and he has his weaknesses. This leads us to the next chapter, that is chapter 9, and the heading of this chapter is A Visit Which the Polite Lady Booby and Her Polite Friend Paid to the Parson. So we as readers are curious to know why Lady Booby now visits Parson Adams. Well, in this chapter, Lady Booby meets the gentleman who assaulted Fanny. She wants to exploit this situation to create a drift between the two lovers, that is Joseph and Fanny. Being a cunning woman, she just wants to take this opportunity to get Joseph away from Fanny and immediately conceives a plan in this regard. Now, working on this plan, as she wants this gentleman whose name is Beau the Dapper to meet Fanny. For this purpose, she decides to take him to Parson Adams' house where Fanny is staying. As Lady Booby takes her guests to see the Adams household, she promises that he would be amused to see how a large family survives on a very low income. This comment of Lady Booby, as she says this to the gentleman who is Beau the Dapper, who is going there to Parson Adams' place with Lady Booby, we can notice the selfishness and the crudeness and the hard-heartedness of Lady Booby, who takes pleasure in seeing that a large family survives on a very low income, and what I would say is under her thumb. Anyhow, as they reach there, Mrs. Adams is embarrassed to receive her upper-class visitors without having tidied up the house for them. Now the Beau utilizes this opportunity to flirt with Fanny there, which is a part of the plan of Lady Booby. This leads us to chapter 10 of book 4, which has a heading that states, The History of Two Friends, which may afford an useful lesson to all those persons who happen to take up their residence in married families. Now, as Lady Booby and this Beau, they are sitting at Parson Adams' place, they also come to know about the drowning incident of the son and how he was rescued. Now Lady Booby starts talking to this young son of Adams, and she insists that he should read something to them. As the son of Adams, Dick, is asked to read for them by Lady Booby, he reads the story of Leonard, a man who was married, and Paul, who is an unmarried friend of this man. In terms of plot and structure of the novel, the story read by Dick is again a digression like the many before, but again it is not without purpose. Fielding, as a moralist and satirist, uses it to convey his message to the reader about human hypocrisy and affectation. Anyhow, the story goes as follows. Paul pays a lengthy visit to Leonard and his wife and discovers that the couple are prone to having big disputes, often concerning the most trivial matters. छोटी छोटी बातों पे उनके झगड़े हो जाते थे. Paul always maintains neutrality during these disputes, but one day in private talks he tells each spouse that he or she may be right on the merits of the argument, but ought to yield the point anyway. For can anything be a greater object of your compassion than a person we love in the wrong? This doctrine of submission has such good effects on the couple that they begin separately to appeal to Paul for advice during every disagreement. The story continues. One day, however, they have an argument in his absence and begin to compare notes regarding the counsel he has given each of them. Naturally, very soon they discover numberless instances in which Paul had, on vows of secrecy, given his opinion on both sides. The couple are now united. Of course, they are very angry towards this two-faced Paul, who returns to find both husband and wife suddenly cold toward him. Paul figures out quickly what has happened, and he and Leonard have a confrontation, and the conclusion of which is preempted by an event that interrupts Dick's reading of the story. Now, what is that interruption? We would soon come to know. But at this point, the chapter comes to an end. This is the list of references of the materials that I have incorporated and used. And with this, I would close today's session. Review of today's session is presented for your convenience. We started book 4, that is the last book of the novel Joseph Andrews. As book 4 is quite a long one, so out of the 16 chapters in this session, we have covered first 10 chapters. We have looked at the headings, important happenings in these chapters, important points of discussion, especially with reference to the selected parts of the text. We have explored themes and development of characters. With reference to some chapters that are important from the perspective of plot and structural development, I have explained how they have played their role in the development of plot and structure. A role of Fielding as a moralist and as a satirist is also discussed in detail with reference to his presentation of different characters and the psychology of those characters. We have also noticed how characters have developed through these chapters, and Fielding's mastery of characterization and his art of presenting the pictures of characters in such a clear way that the reader gets them exactly they are presented is also discussed. With this, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you very much.